Well, Mark, I'm really pleased to be meeting with you. I'm excited to talk about your important book, Trigger Points, that was really touching to me. The subtitle is "Inside the Mission to Stop Mass Shootings in America." So it's obviously very timely, very important. And before we do that, though, I'd like to just get a little deeper on your background. I know you've been a journalist for quite some time, and tell us a little bit about your journalistic background generally, and we'll kind of go into a little more detail about what you've been doing recently and then into the book.
Sure. Well, I came to the Bay Area in the mid 1990s after I graduated college, and was always interested in being a writer and a journalist. I didn't actually have journalism training in school. I did growing up in high school, but did not pursue it in college. But then began doing some freelance writing in the Bay Area in the 90s. I was actually started out focused on the arts and music. I was primarily a music writer, did some theater and film reviews and those kinds of things. And really got into political journalism and investigative reporting starting in the early 2000s after 9/11, which of course was a world-altering event. And then with the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003. That was the real pivot point for me, that era, into political reporting and investigations. And I worked originally for Salon.com for a number of years, and then did some other projects, and then moved over to Mother Jones in 2011. And that's been my journalistic home since.
Yeah, that's really where I first connected with your work. As you know, I've worked in the area of gender medicine and men's health. And as part of that work, I've worked over the years a lot with the areas where men often are out of balance with themselves and their lives, and in extreme cases, become angry and violent, either act out or act in violence. And so my first connection was with the work you were doing at Mother Jones, and really, I think it certainly was the first I had come across of beginning to collect a whole database on, the mass shootings that we all knew about, but seemed like there'd be one and then there would be another, and you didn't hear much about the past ones, or that in fact there were a number and that there were things we might learn about this whole thing. Could you tell us a little bit about how that came to be, your interest at Mother Jones, and maybe as you introduce that for those that don't know Mother Jones, a little bit about the magazine and what the magazine is, how you came to be there, and then how you got into this particular area of reporting.
Sure. So Mother Jones is a reader-supported nonprofit news organization that was founded in the Bay Area in the 1970s and has evolved a lot over the years, including becoming one of the first digital magazines in the .com era. And of course, like everything else, is a major digital news organization now, as well as still a print magazine, subscriber based. And so I started there in 2011, and I had been covering gun violence as a journalist previous to that. To some extent, I had done some reporting around the Virginia Tech massacre in 2007, and some various things after that. But it was really in 2012 that I began to focus, now a decade ago, on the issue of mass shootings. That was a particularly horrific year with a number of attacks. There was the massacre at a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado in July 2012. That's what really began the kind of longer journey into this work for me. When that happened, that was an overnight event because it had occurred at a midnight premiere of the new Batman film, The Dark Knight. And so we woke up to that news on Friday, July 20th, and it was very shocking at the time. It's a little bit hard to recall in those terms now because we've had so much of this problem since, and it has escalated in some ways in terms of the scale of the problem. But at the time, that was really an unprecedented event. Someone walking into a movie theater and murdering 12 people and wounding dozens of others. It was, it really hit me in a way that previous attacks hadn't quite at that point. Also because it had taken place in a movie theater, that was unprecedented as well. And one of the fundamental questions for me at that point was, how much is this happening? Because there had been the prior year, there'd been the attack on the political gathering in Tucson, Arizona, with then Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords. It was a very shocking event. And there was a sense that maybe this was an accelerating problem, but I went looking for data on this. I was also interested in understanding more about what led a person to do something like that, that is so seemingly unrelatable and hard to explain. And so when I went looking for data on this problem, I found virtually nothing. It was quite startling that there had been no effort, from what I could tell, to gather data on this problem. And so we decided quickly at Mother Jones that we would do that ourselves, that we would try to put together a database of these types of events going back 30 years. And we had to quickly sort of develop a set of criteria to do this with. So I talked to some experts in criminology and called up the FBI because I'd found this report that they'd done a few years prior about serial mass murder that had sort of backed into a definition of mass shootings. How do you define what this event is? Part of it is an arbitrary decision about the number of victims. At the time, that was described by the FBI and by some leading experts who studied mass murder as events in which 4 or more victims were killed. Why isn't it 5 or 7 or 3, right? But kind of going through the process of trying to figure out how to put some parameters around this event we had just seen and then try to study it was really the genesis of the database work. And so we soon published the first of its kind online database documenting these types of attacks. And that quickly led to a lot of other kinds of reporting that I was doing, looking into the issue, and set me down the path that also eventually led to writing Trigger Points.
It was such important research because as a clinician who works with relationships and angry men, violent men, I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do as clinicians is how can we understand what happens, what's the underlying causes. And although these kind of mass killings are dramatic, there's certainly a lot of other levels of violence that goes on that we're trying to understand. And I'd be interested just in a little bit of an evolution of your own understanding from beginning to put together this database, which started when did you start putting the information together that became the database that you eventually published in Mother Jones? And then
so it was that day, July 20th, 2012.
Okay.
We published an initial iteration of it that day, based on a handful of cases. And then by about a week later, we had an initial data set of 62 cases, if I'm remembering correctly, that I'd begun doing some deeper analysis on. And then, of course, we began adding to it relatively frequently. And soon thereafter, there were a number of attacks that fall. And then Sandy Hook took place in Newtown, Connecticut that December. By that point, there had been significant interest on the database, but that really took it to the next level in terms of interest in the work and some of the reporting it was leading me to. And so, to your point, I think, initially this work that I was doing and with several of my colleagues had come out of the kind of more traditional lens on the problem of gun violence and namely the political fight we have over it that's gone on for so many years over gun regulations and the lack of good research on gun violence that was in large part due to the politicization of it and the sort of repression of suppression of research. But what I had begun to realize through studying these cases was that there was a whole deep story here of human behavior and of behavioral science that spoke to questions of the nature of this problem and what more we could do about it. And that became of really keen interest to me. I think many people had already grown frustrated long ago with the sort of stuck sense of the political debate and the very kind of polarized arguments about it that really felt like it was going nowhere, right? And meanwhile, we had this widespread problem of gun violence, not just with mass shootings, of course, much more broadly with daily gun violence and with suicide and other issues. So to me, it quickly started to look like a real opportunity to go deeper into this problem, and specifically with mass shootings, questions of why and how a person would get to the point of doing something like this. And realizing early on, too, that there were some big myths we had about this problem, too, and misunderstanding about it, not only for a lack of information, but ways in which it was becoming politicized and the way that political figures would use those myths to distract from the debate over policy reform. And I'm being a little circumspect here, but a big part of this is mental illness and mental health, right? The way that mental illness is blamed fundamentally for causing mass shootings, which turns out to be wrong. That is a big myth that we have about this problem. We can talk more about that, of course, but that was an early insight for me in doing this work, seeing that a lot of mass shooters had a lot of mental health problems, and many were suicidal, and yet they were not crazy, they were not insane, they were not delusional. Was learning this through case evidence and through interviews with experts in the field of threat assessment, which became the focus of the book.
I want to get into that in more detail. And one of the things from my perspective and my background, both clinically and the work I do, is that one of the facts, and I just want to verify this fact with you in terms of the whole database and then what's happened since the book was published, because there have been more killings since what you're reporting in the book. But one of the facts, I believe, is that all or almost all of the killers are male. Is that accurate?
That's correct. The overwhelming majority are male. Although even with this point, there is, I think, a bit of misconception, particularly with threat cases. There are a number of threat cases, and there are more of them in recent years that do involve females. Again, this is a very small fraction of the overall problem, but particularly with school shooting threats, there are some cases that involve girls. But yes, it is primarily, overwhelmingly a male problem.
So I'd be interested in, as I think part of learning about not only mass shootings and how do we prevent them, but also violence in general and what the causes are and whether they're getting worse. I'm guessing, and you can again tell me just factually, I'm interested in, are females becoming more involved? Is that becoming a problem? Because I'm assuming, and you can tell me if this is accurate or not, that the ones that I remember going way back were pretty much all males. I don't remember any, at least notarized females getting involved. Are females becoming more violent, or is this become an increasing problem for females, or is it still a predominantly male problem?
I think it's predominantly a male problem. I don't have any data to suggest that it's a growing problem among females. I was just pointing out the existence of that in a very small number to say that, more broadly, again, with the mythology of this problem of targeted violence and of mass shootings, is the idea that we have some kind of predictive profile. And that just simply doesn't exist. So gender is in no way predictive of this problem, even though it is predominantly a male problem. And there are some really interesting questions around that we'll get into. But I think that it's just another way of the general public understanding better that the ways in which we think we understand this problem or the ways in which we hear about it in politics and in the media is often distorted or even misleading.
Right.
So, we shouldn't automatically assume that no girl or woman would ever do this, because there are cases historically where they do. In terms of studying it for trend, it's difficult in the same way that mass shootings are in general, that what's known as the low base rate problem. There's just very little data. I mean, there are only a few cases like this historically.
Right.
But I have seen some threat cases in more recent years that involve adolescent females, sometimes in combination with boys, plotting to attack a school, that kind of thing. So it's not exclusively male, but it is very much predominantly male.
Well, let's get into the findings of the book, because there's some really important things that both surface some of the myths that have been kind of promulgated in our minds and in the media that aren't true, that you've found out. So you mentioned a few of them. Maybe you could go in some more detail of some of the myths, and then what are some of the things that you've found that can help us as you put them into the book. And maybe before you even start that, when did the book come out? And because we know that there's been some killings since then. So
yeah,
people are buying the book. What period does that cover?
Yeah, as I worked on this book for over several years, I knew, of course, that in this sense that you're pointing to, it would become outdated in a literal way very quickly. And that has happened. The book came out on April 5th this year. And since then, we've had these major attacks. Just recently, the Buffalo, New York supermarket massacre that happened a few weeks ago. And then, of course, this horrific event in Texas with Robb Elementary School in Uvalde. Those are the big ones. There have been some other significant attacks, too, since early April. But I really, I tried to write the book in a way that was also forward-looking and would anticipate that, of course, more of this would happen. And looking at the history of cases as well as the current ones, a lot of this is the same story. We're adding data to it, unfortunately, as time goes on pretty regularly. So in terms of the myths, we've touched on them so far. I think one, of course, that's important is that there is no such thing as a predictive profile of a mass shooter. That's a common misconception that I think is often confused in the general public with the notion of criminal profiling. This is something that historically became well known and sort of famous in our pop culture with the FBI's hunting of serial killers. And that is a form of profiling that is retrospective, trying to identify a violent criminal who is going around killing and whose identity is unknown, trying to figure out through personal characteristics who that person might be and then track them down, right? This is the famous, Silence of the Lambs film and the Mindhunter series on Netflix, developed from one of the founders of that work at the FBI's behavioral science unit back in the day. The work that goes into threat assessment is distinct. It's, as I describe it in Trigger Points, it's really about profiling a behavioral process, not people. Because all kinds of people have committed mass shootings, and that goes hand in hand with what I'm saying about profile. I think there's a wide misconception still that there's only a certain type of person who commits a mass shooting. We do see a lot of young males who are white who do this. But there are a lot of other people who've done it too. There's a broader age range, and there are people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds. Again, primarily male, but there's no set of characteristics or type of person that is helpful in terms of forecasting this type of violence. So that's one of the myths that I dig into with the book. Another, and perhaps the most important, relates to mental illness. As we were already touching on, I talk about this a lot in the book through the research and through the storytelling that I do about cases and about the work that practitioners have done. And of course, this is front and center again with these major attacks we've just experienced, when we see after every major attack, politicians and other political forces that are invested in maintaining the status quo in terms of gun politics in our country will immediately blame mental illness and point to that as the fundamental cause of this problem, of these attacks. And in my view, that they're doing that primarily as a tactic of distraction to get away from the policy debates about firearms and firearm regulation. And what's tricky here is that, of course, mental health is a very significant part of this problem. And I think that the issue in some sense is that we sort of run up against the limits of lay language and lay understanding of mental health problems. I'm sure you have some good thoughts on this yourself. The way that I talk about this in the book, and have written about it again recently for Mother Jones, is that when politicians tell the public that this is all about mental illness, so the NRA says these are insane monsters who just snap, all this kind of language we're familiar with, it's very misleading in a fundamental sense, because the people who commit mass shootings are not crazed monsters who impulsively lash out. That's not how these attacks work. The process that leads up to them is lengthy, involves rational planning and thinking in most cases, and is a process of escalating behavior. And so it's not someone who is totally insane, who's hearing voices or hallucinating, who then just like runs out and shoots up a school or a supermarket or a movie theater. That's very rare in mass shooting cases. The majority of these cases are people who are suffering from a lot of deep problems, deep grievance that they can't let go of, rage, despair, a lot of suicidality, as I was saying earlier, and a lot of circumstantial problems, lack of social connection, people who are becoming more withdrawn and isolated, failing out of school, losing their jobs, losing a relationship, failing in relationships, family disputes, domestic abuse and conflict. Lots of factors like this mark the majority of these cases. And so we're talking about a very different picture of mental health here that isn't about people who are completely detached from reality. And that's the implication that we hear politically and in a lot of media narratives to this day that I try to really debunk through the work of the book, because that's an important fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of this problem.
Well, I think one of the really important things that I learned from the book that I think really can point to helpful things that, in a sense, the average person, because who we're talking to and who the book I think speaks to, and what everybody who has children or is concerned about our children wants to know: how can we prevent this? How can we stop it? Are there things that we could learn that will help us? And I think one of the problems that you very well surface is that people generally, and certainly in different circles, want a simple solution.
Right.
Give us, and I think the profiling, just give us the profile, give us a picture of who they are, and then we can go get those people. Or they're these crazed mass, psychotic people, and we'll just get them and figure out who they are and lock them up, kind of thing. These are very complex issues, and there really aren't these politically simple solutions. But what we really want to know, and you get into this in detail, and I want you to maybe talk a little bit more about the learnings that you got from the people that are really looking at threat assessment, that really helps us understand that these are not out of the blue happenings, that they're things that we can do that help us predict these kind of behaviors in individual cases, and that together as a whole community, there are many things that we know are likely to be helpful. And there are also things that the myths and some of the political focus says, if we do this politically, this is popular, but we know it really isn't helpful. So could you talk a little bit about what you learned in the very in-depth studies that you did, and with experts from the FBI and others that really can teach us about what we can learn that would really help us prevent problems in the future.
Yeah, well, one of the things that really drew me to this subject was seeing the kind of incredible synergy in the collaboration of the work among mental health experts and law enforcement experts, bringing to bear the expertise on human behavior and research into that, also with together with the investigative expertise of law enforcement agents who were part of the pioneering of this work. And I tell those stories early in the book. There's a really kind of fascinating history of how this field was developed. I'll get into that a little bit more, but first, let me say that I think in terms of what you're pointing to, there are a couple of ways that I try to express early in the book, ways for people to kind of access this paradigm better, because as you say, it is very complex in some ways, that both in terms of what this problem is and then this approach to dealing with it. One of the things that I say about the problem and this approach to dealing with it through threat assessment is that it's important to know that this is a method of prevention. It's not about prediction. There's no way to really predict violence. People have tried for a long time through research to figure that out. And this points again to the mental illness myth that, we know through a lot of research over the past decades that mental illness is in no way predictive of violence. There's a very small correlation there. So it's prevention, not prediction. The other kind of formulation that I like for this is that I say early in the book that really for the work of behavioral threat assessment and threat management, the question of why someone commits a mass shooting in some ways is almost secondary to the question of how. And again, this speaks to the behavioral process that leads up to it. The work of threat assessment is really focused on the behaviors and circumstances that lead up to an attack like this, that process and the patterns within that process that can be studied and used as a basis of knowledge to try to prevent people from going down what the field calls the pathway to violence. So to your point, the public has a very strong appetite for a simple or clear explanation of problems, and especially I think in the face of unspeakable horror, school children being massacred. How do you explain that? And the public wants and demands an explanation. And I think part of that need in which is highly relatable and understandable is to answer the question of why. Why would someone do this? What is the motive? But the problem is, in a lot of these cases, motive is difficult to untangle. We don't always know clearly why someone does this horrific act that we regard as sinister and evil and unrelatable, and yet it's human behavior. So then the question is, how else can we understand it? And so I think the question of how almost becomes more important. Of course, why someone does this, trying to ascertain motive and mindset is important to the process of how. What is a person thinking and what is driving them as they go down this pathway to violence? But then also looking at the behaviors that they're engaging in, the circumstances that are shaping their behavior, that speaks to the process that is often detectable, because the good news here is that there are warning signs. There are identifiable warning signs of someone headed in this direction. They're often noticeable to people around the perpetrators, and that is the opportunity to intervene. That is the premise of the work of threat assessment, and why I was drawn so much to study it and learn more about it as a potential additional solution to this problem.
Well, I think one of the reasons I think your book is so important is that in the aftermath of a shooting, there's a tremendous amount of trauma that everybody feels. Certainly the families that are involved, the communities that are involved, but everybody then, because we're human, we identify, we feel that we see it on TV, it's up close and personal. And I think in the aftermath, in a way, everybody is going through some collective trauma that this could happen. And could it happen to me? Could it happen to my child? Could it happen in my community? And the other response is that feeling of we just have to do something, and you often hear just do something. And there's almost a feeling of, rather than figure out what can we do that would really work long range, because as you point out, there really is no way to predict a specific act of violence. How can we figure out what happens so that next time we'll know exactly how to prevent that happening? But there are things that we can do to understand what the process is, so that we can take action to reduce that risk. So I'd like to ask you on 3 levels. I'll give you a warning so you'll know what I'm going to ask. But one level, I'd like you to answer, what can we do? What would be helpful from the research that you got when you wrote the book? So in a sense, as a researcher, as a reporter, you learned some things from some experts. So I want to ask you from that point of view. Then I'm going to ask you to maybe expand on that, because in a way, when you talk to the experts in a way that very few people have talked to, all the people you've talked to over many years and studied it as part of your reportorial work. But then I'm going to ask you, just as a guy that's talked to a lot of experts, what do you think would be helpful, from separate from your research? And then finally, I'm going to ask you, which is what we're all ask ourselves who are parents. I'm a father of 5 children and 17 grandchildren. You have parents. I think all of us then are asking ourselves, just as a parent, what can I do? So start with what you've learned from the experts that are in your book, that is a gathering of information from those that you found were really expert in the field, from law enforcement, from mental health, and from other areas that you researched.
Sure. Well, I think, again, one of the reasons I was really drawn to this subject matter was, I guess, due to a certain paradox with it, that it is so difficult and so grim and dark and traumatic, and we feel that, all of us as a society, every time one of these happens, as people. I feel it as a journalist, but I feel it also as a father and a son, and in a community. And so one of the things I noticed about experts in this field, the pioneers of it and the leaders of it that I got to know in the course of writing Trigger Points, was that they are, by and large, optimists in a certain way, in a way that I identified with as an investigative journalist, that is trying to study and shine a light on a problem that may be so difficult and cause so much sense of despair, and yet knowing that we can do a lot to solve hard problems. And so, yes, people want clear, easy, simple answers, and often that sort of recombines with the emotions and politics of the gun debate, and then we have the same arguments over and over again after every massacre. But really, as I got to know the people doing this work and who were building this work, I could see that they really cared deeply about preventing violence. And not only is it possible, but through a commitment to that work, a lot of that was being done. And I started learning about all these cases, quite a few of which I write about at length in the book. I mean, that to me became the heart of the book, was telling those stories, because we don't hear about them in the public because the outcomes are good, meaning there is no violence. And so, of course, that's not news, and we don't ever see that in the news. So largely this is happening out of view, and yet there's this very profound progress being made in a lot of situations like this. And I think, in answer to your question, fundamentally, it's about community awareness and engagement, about connection between people, helping each other more, watching out for someone who's in trouble. Most of these cases can be described that way. At some point, along that trajectory, that pathway to violence. And in all of the threat cases that I was able to go deep inside and study and watch them being worked, and see successful early interventions, you can see more explicitly where the need for that is there. Meaning a couple things practically. One, when a person or people around a would-be attacker or offender notices something wrong, they reach out for help. That is vital. Most of these cases begin that way, these successful threat cases that are managed and steered into a better direction. And that's true in school settings, in workplace settings, in religious institutions, and just in communities more broadly where this work has been done with success. So I think that, for leaders in the field of threat assessment, creating more community awareness of the warning behaviors and more engagement and trust among the public that there is this process that exists through local community leaders who are working together in mental health, in law enforcement, in education, in other professions, collaboratively to address specific cases of concern, that this can be a very valuable tool in communities. So I think that building awareness, for starters, is important. Educating the public more, the true nature of this problem, as we've been discussing, to kind of set aside these myths that this is an unresolvable, inexplicable problem of evil, of deadlocked politics. Putting all that aside and saying, no, we can understand this better. There's more we can do in our communities to work to prevent it, to be more proactive. Because that's another big problem, in my view, that we have as a society in responding to mass shootings now for decades, is that we are so reactive to the problem. And we take all of these steps that are reactive in nature. We do what's called in law enforcement target hardening. We make school buildings and or office parks and other public places more secure, turning them more into fortresses. Basic physical security is of course important, but I think that we overdo that as a response to this, in the sense that it's not going to prevent attacks from happening. The idea is that maybe it mitigates some of the damage when it does happen, but of course the tragedy we just saw in Uvalde really belies that view. I mean, there were a lot of measures taken along these lines in that school system and with the local police force to try to defend that school, but it didn't work. And there are other cases like that too. These active shooter drills that we have now, ubiquitously in the country over the past decade, that may help to reduce loss of life in the event of an attack, but it doesn't prevent an attack from occurring. And so why do we pour so many resources into these kinds of reactive measures when we could be doing more, in my view, to do prevention work of this nature?
I think that's to me one of the really important take-homes for me from the book and the work that you're reporting in the book, is that it seems to me there are two really unhelpful and unhealthy and dangerous responses each time there's a killing. One is that there is a huge response of do something, and then often it becomes politically charged in this group wanting to do this and the other group saying, no, we need to do the other. And it's kind of an escalating, who can say, no, that won't work, we got to do this. And the result of that, which I think is the real danger, is that people start feeling hopeless. They start feeling there's really either nothing that we can agree to do because we're just going to fight about it, or there really is nothing that can be done. It's just one of those things you got to live with. It's like the weather. You just kind of wait, and maybe it's going to rain, maybe it's not. And I think what your book does more than anything for me is it reports a very different and much more hopeful view of what can be done, because it turns out there's really a lot that we can do to prevent. And when you get into it. You hear the stories, you hear the reporting, you disconnect from these often more publicly charged debates that really, bottom line, leave people feeling more hopeless and
Yeah.
give up. Your book says, hey, there's some things that we have learned that have worked. As you say, you don't see what gets prevented because that's not often the news that gets reported, but it's really good news to know that there's been a lot of things that have been done to prevent. And the even better news is there's a lot of things that we can do moving forward to understand these problems, so they are complex, to address, the issues of isolation and disconnection that we can all do something about. So
Yeah, well, and I just want to add there too, I think
yeah,
it's really important to say, to make clear that these are not mutually exclusive things either.
right.
That we can do this kind of prevention work and think about it through this perspective while also pursuing progress on gun policy and any other number of issues that feed into this. It's not one or the other, it's all the above,
Right.
in my view. And I've been writing recently about how I think that the sort of knee-jerk response to these events that we're so conditioned to now, that in and of itself is part of the problem, that we automatically everyone goes to their corners politically and has the same argument, and also kind of perpetuates this theme of hopelessness and resignation, that there's nothing that we can ever really do, that nothing ever really changes. That in a way, in my view, is validating this form of violence in a way that's unhelpful in terms of efforts and focus in society to make progress on it through various forms, but also in what it says to people who may be thinking about doing this. Because we know from a lot of case evidence that perpetrators of mass shootings are seeking attention and seeking validation for the form of violence that they choose to undertake. And so when the media and the political environment keeps telling the world over and over that this is an endless problem, this problem can never be solved, it will happen again, the people who might be thinking about doing it say, hey, that's me. I'm going to be the next school shooter. I'm going to get my revenge or my notoriety through an act like this because I can, because it will go on. That's become my perspective on it. I think that we can see this in case evidence. I wrote about this last week in Mother Jones, that one school threat case that I had looked at, there was a kid who had said, school shootings happen all the time, and essentially said, if I do this, I could get famous. And was coming to see this as a valid solution to his own suffering and problems, as a way out. That marks a lot of the behavioral process and thinking process in these cases, and that's important.
Well, I want to kind of wrap things up by checking to see, I think as people listen to you, as I listen to you, one, I have the good fortune to having got my copy of the book, but I just want to let people know and have you say, one, where people can find the book and how they can get it, and maybe more importantly, or equally importantly, maybe not more importantly, because as a writer, and we want people to get this information, and I want people to read this book because it's helpful, and there's nothing out there like it that I think speaks to these issues in a way that I think is rational and helpful and compassionate and caring, and speaking both from a journalist, a writer, and a father and grandfather, but also how people can connect with you, because you mentioned you continue to write, and you're writing articles, and I think people who are watching this who say, yeah, God, I'd like to hear more from this guy. I'd like to find out more about what he's saying now and what he's saying since the book came out. So talk about how people can get the book, and then talk about how people can find you and learn more about what you're continuing to say and write about.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'll say just a couple more things about what's in the book for people's interest too. So the book is called Trigger Points: Inside the Mission to Stop Mass Shootings in America. Came out in April from HarperCollins. It's available everywhere books are available, online in stores. You can just Google Trigger Points and my name, Mark Fullman, or Trigger Points in Mass Shootings, and you'll find it. Um, One of the other things I wanted to mention about the book, and I alluded to this earlier, was that there's a really interesting history to the development of this field too. And what really drew me to that part of the work of writing the book was the way in which it spoke so much to big things in our cultural and political history of the last few decades. In short, the work was originally developed out of efforts to study political assassination and to prevent that. So there was a foundational collaboration between forensic psychologists and Secret Service agents trying to figure out that problem more. And this was also developing in some other ways in the 1980s and 90s, with a focus on workplace violence in what was then known as the era of going postal, with a lot of the post office shootings. There was a big focus on celebrity stalking in the 1980s, some work that the LAPD was doing. So you have this growing in different areas of the country in different settings, in some really interesting ways. At the FBI, at the Secret Service, the LAPD, in mental health circles, and these streams begin to converge as threat assessment is developing. So there's a lot of fascinating stories in that speak to some major traumatic events historically too. The murder of John Lennon, the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan, the killing of a young Hollywood actress in 1989 named Rebecca Schaefer. So I tell a lot of those stories in the book too, as a way of really explaining the development of this behavioral science and the method. And I wanted to do that with the book. I wanted it to be really a narrative work that people could really access this information through storytelling, because it is complicated and you can explain it conceptually, but until you really see how it works in a real world setting, it's harder to relate to. And the other kind of major facet of the book in this sense is that I also then immerse in some threat assessment programs, and specifically in a school setting in Oregon. There's a K through 12 district there that was one of the pioneers of this model after Columbine. And I was able to spend a lot of time there in 2019 with the threat assessment team, watching them work, going inside their confidential case files, talking with them about the work, and really telling some deep stories of students, troubled students who were at serious risk of planning violence like this, how they were helped, how they were steered away from violent planning. And to me, that really contains the hope in the book that there are many cases like this where this work has been done to remarkable effect. There's also some survivors in the book, mass shooting survivors, who are very compelling people, extraordinary people who have gotten involved in this work. And tell their story. I tell their stories of survival and resilience that I think speaks a lot to the nature of the problem, and also viewing it through a constructive perspective. So I hope that people find it compelling in a way that is not stuck in the ways that we are so grim about all the time. This is a horrible problem. It's devastating. I mean, what we just saw in Texas in particular, sort of a repeat of the Sandy Hook experience a decade ago, which was in some ways really the beginning of this work for me. So yeah, the book's called Trigger Points, and thank you for your interest in it. I'm also very active on social media on Twitter at Mark Fullman. Follman is how my last name is spelled. I share a lot of my current and ongoing work there, and I'm happy to hear from people and continue the dialogue. My work is also at Mother Jones, of course.
Well, that's great, Mark, and thank you. Really, I guess final thing I would want to say to the audience is that one, I work in the field. This is kind of an area I work in, so I was fascinated by the book because this is what I do for a living, is counsel and guide people and help people learn important things that would be helpful as parents and as people that want to have better world for everybody. But I want to also just underline a thing. I think it's obvious, but maybe not, that uh, many of us, I think, both are drawn to, something that is dangerous because we want to protect ourselves and we want to protect our families. And we also repelled by it. It's like it's certainly mass killings of children is almost too horrible to even want to think about.
Yeah.
And so part of, I think, what may not be obvious by the title of the book, uh, but I hope is obvious having talked with you, is that this is not just about killings and mass shootings. It's really about people and about how we can all do better to care for each other, to be sensitive to the disconnections that are in our own lives and the lives of people we know. And it's, for me, really a very hopeful book, and leads to some really, I think, very positive ways of being able to just help each other to live better lives, not just prevent mass shootings, but to prevent violence, and not just to prevent violence, but to help people that are lonely and cut off and don't feel that they're being heard or that people care about them. So I just wanted to thank you again for your work and your continued work. And I, for one, want to stay in touch with you, and I hope others genuinely take advantage of staying connected with you and reading the book and reading what you write for Mother Jones and following you on Twitter and the other places that you do work. So thank you again.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jed. That's really well said, and I appreciate that. Ultimately, I think Trigger Points is a book about human behavior and human connection, and in that inherently is good. Humans are capable of terrible things, but if we believe that people are inherently good or have the capacity to be good, there's a lot we can do to think about this problem constructively. And I really tried to make that the focus of the book. So thank you for your interest in it. And I really enjoyed talking with you about it today.
Hey, great. Thanks so much. And hopefully we can do this again sometime.
I'd be happy to. Thanks.